So welcome everybody. My name is Rabbi Alyssa Mendelson, if we haven't met before, and I am the rabbi of Port Jewish Center here in Port Washington, New York. And we are thrilled to welcome you to tonight's program with Rachel Barenbaum. If you don't know who Rachel Barenbaum is, you will surely be impressed with her by the end of our program tonight. Her debut novel is A Bend in the Stars, which is the book that our book group read in preparation for Rachel to come speak with us, and it's the book she'll be talking about tonight. It was named a New York Times Summer Reading Selection, a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Selection. It's also a Boston Globe bestseller, and the Boston area is now Rachel's hometown. So they know a good local when they see one there. And fortunately for us, Rachel has a second novel coming out, Atomic Anna, and it's coming out in a year from now in 2022 from Grand Central Press. Rachel is a prolific writer and a reviewer for the LA Review of Books, the Tel Aviv Review of Books, and Dead Darlings, whatever that is. What's the Dead Darlings? Anyway, she is an honorary research associate at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute at Brandeis University and a graduate of Grub Street's Novel Incubator. She's also the founder of Debut Spotlight and the debut editor at A Mighty Blaze. In a former life, she was a hedge fund manager and a spin instructor. And she has degrees from Harvard in business and literature and philosophy. She lives in Brookline, Massachusetts. And we are so incredibly lucky to have her with us tonight. So Rachel, without any further ado, although that was a good amount of ado, I'd say, I'd like to turn things over to you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Rabbi, and everybody for taking time tonight to listen and to talk about books and my book in particular. I just love being here and I'm so excited. I love talking to anyone who's reading my book because I always say, you know, I know my mom's going to read it, but it's amazing when someone other than my mom reads the book. So I'm thrilled to see so many of you here. This red cover in the background here, this is my paperback cover. Some of you might have read the hardcover. Here it is coming into view. Woo, there it is, the blue one. Same book, different cover. But I will be reading just a couple of passages too from the blue one. So if you have it, I'll give you the page numbers, but no pressure or anything. So to get started, I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to take you through a presentation. And so I'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then I'll open it up to questions. So I'm so thrilled that you guys are a book group and that you've read the book. So I won't worry too much. Most of you, I'll say, okay, have read the book. So I won't give away too many spoilers, but it usually makes for better questions in the end. So thank you. So you probably heard that I started off at a hedge fund, and I taught spin class while I was working at the hedge fund, and just loved it. And how did that happen? How did I become a writer? And the answer is that I've been writing novels since about the third grade and dreamed of being a writer. I studied with Jamaica Kincaid as an undergraduate. And then I got a fellowship in Israel and started living on the academic salary and had my loans coming due. And it became clear very quickly that I was not going to be able to afford writing full time. And so I went into business. Meanwhile, writing books all the time, writing books at night, writing them on the weekends, whenever I could, reading voraciously. And then I started to think as I entered the Harvard Business School, maybe this isn't really what I'm meant to be doing, you know, trading stocks, working my hedge fund. And when you show up, you know, before you're even on campus, they send you this questionnaire, and the business school says, you know, where do you see yourself in 10 or 20 years from now? Do you see yourself in a boardroom, on a factory floor? Do you see yourself, you know, as a consultant? What, you know, and they give this whole list of like 10 things. And then the very bottom, the last question is, or do you know, the last choice is novelist. So I'm like, oh my God, there are other people who want to write at business school. So I check off novelist. And they call me in, the career services, and they're like, we wanted to talk to you about your survey. No one here ever checks off novelist. Like, are you sure you're in the right school? I was like, well, you know, I really want to be a writer, but I can't afford it. So what should I do, right? And I'm looking to them like they're supposed to give me the big answers, right? And they were like, well, why don't you just hang in and see how it goes? So they weren't helpful. And I just kept doing what I was doing and writing whenever I could. In 2014, I sat down and I said, what are you still doing trading stocks and writing at night. I had 3 full novels that I had written and sent out to agents. I had, which is the first step to publishing a novel. You have to find representation and you write something called a query letter. I had over 300 rejections by this point. And I just sat there and said, well, what do you want to do? I mean, if you want to write, why are you trading stocks? Obviously, you're not writing as well as you could, right? So I started writing what would become A Bend in the Stars that year. And then I applied to Grub Street, which is a writing center here in Boston. They have a 1-year program called the Novel Incubator. And there are 10 of us that were in the class. And you spend a year, basically working on your novel, your full manuscript, and you have to apply, right? So they read it. All of us have a full book that we're working on for the year. And I still remember the moment that I got my acceptance to this program. I was actually in Israel with my family, and I was like, this is it, right? I'm changing my life right here, right now. And I quit. I just closed my fund, and I had a couple of other things going on, other businesses. I just closed it all and I jumped into writing full time. And it was terrifying. And I'm still a little terrified that I did that. But starting in 2015, I started writing full time. And, I think it paid off. Every year I said I had to have something that would happen. And so I really got to work on this manuscript. Through that year at Grub Street, I came to, write this novel. I made it so much better than what it was beforehand. For those of you who haven't finished, Bend in the Stars is set in 1914 Russia, and it's the story about a Jewish scientist who's racing Einstein to prove relativity. The scientist, his name is Vanya. He's so bent on proving relativity that he endangers his family. He runs across Russia. He goes missing, actually. And his sister, Miri, goes after him. She's Russia's first female surgeon. She's the protagonist. She is the hero. And she encounters all sorts of adventure along the way. There's love and science and history. And that's what grew into A Bend in the Stars. So where did I get this idea, this notion that, a scientist would race, someone would be racing Einstein to prove relativity? Well, in 2014, I was reading this issue of Scientific American. And in the very back of the magazine, there's a section where they have, they say something like 25 years ago this month, 50 years ago this month, and then it said 100 years ago this month, Einstein was just on the verge of proving relativity. He had this idea, he had the big idea, he had equations, which were wrong, but he had equations, but he didn't have physical evidence. The proof that he needed would be a photograph of a total solar eclipse that he could use to measure, because he could actually see stars, right, in this total solar eclipse, and measure how much light bent according to his theory of gravity and relativity. So he gathered up all this money, he raised money, gathered up an expedition, he sent the group up to Russia, and then World War I broke out, and his expedition never even made it across the border. So Einstein did not get his proof in 1914. It wasn't until 1919 that Arthur Eddington very famously got the photograph, and Einstein was crowned, right, the king of relativity, the genius of all geniuses. But at the time, in 1914, there were actually a number of people racing him for that photograph, a number of people racing to find better math. Everyone agreed that Einstein had the idea that he was challenging Newton. Many people agreed that he was right to challenge Newton. Maybe just as many said he was this crazy Jew, but he was on to something, right? But he didn't quite get there. And I thought, even before I put that magazine down, well, that's a book. I mean, someone was racing Einstein. What if I could write that story about the scientist, the Jewish scientist who was racing Einstein? And what if he beat him? Or maybe he didn't. I don't know. I've got to write the book, right? So I put the magazine down and I really started researching the time period and Einstein in 1914 and relativity. So fast forward to 2016, at the end of my 1 year at Grub Street, I was able to find an agent at William Morris Endeavor, and I worked on the manuscript for a whole other year with her and 2 other agents at the agency, and a lot of edits, a lot of drafts. And then Grand Central bought it in 2017, and I worked with my editor then for another year and a half, just editing and going through this book. And then it came out in hardback in 2019. So a long process, right? Started in 2014, took a long time, and I loved every minute of it. It is truly a dream come true to be able to go through this, to write this book, and to see it come out into the world. But to really dig into this time period and to dig into 1914 Russia, I had to sort of dig into my own past because my own family came from Russia around that time. And I grew up with these two great aunts. They came to my house every Friday, just about every Friday for Shabbat dinner. And my grandmother, their sister, had died when I was very young. So they came and it was, it was their responsibility, right, to teach me, to be there. And I loved them very much, except they would come over and they would lean very close and they would say, Rachel, Rachel. They'd call me over. And I was the oldest and I knew it was coming. So I would go over and I was always a little scared. They smelled a lot like Manischewitz and herring. And they would lean very, very close and they would say, Rachel, do you know where the passports are? Do you know where the emergency money is? And I would nod because I knew that was my job. And they would say, good. We ran from Russia. We might have to run from America. And I would say, what? Like, when? How do I know? What do you mean we have to run? And they say, you'll know. And I just, what are you talking about? And I would push and I would push and I would say, what was so bad? Why did you have to leave? What was so horrible? And they would say, you know what? We're not even going to talk about it. We're Americans. We speak English. There was no Yiddish, no Russian in my house. We only spoke English. We were American, 100%. And so they wouldn't tell me anything about it. And so that was like all I wanted to know. Right? What happened in Russia? How bad could it possibly have been? And so for years, I'd read about the history. I knew, the plight of Jews living in Russia, and I had read these tales, but I couldn't imagine it. And when I sat down to write this book, I had to see it. I had to know, what did Miri actually see when she walked down the street? What was so terrible that they would have to run? So I dug into all kinds of picture archives. YIVO in particular has an online Jewish encyclopedia. It's a fantastic library, and you can sort of go down the rabbit hole there and click through hundreds, thousands of pictures. And I came across this picture in particular. And this picture really just, for me, framed, the reasons for why my family fled. What was so terrible for Jews living in Russia? We weren't Russian. We were Jews living in Russia, in the Pale, in the shtetls, right? In the absolute worst part of the country where nobody wanted to be. And this is what it was like to live in Russia, right? This is why my family left. Look at the shoes on the boy in the front, no socks. The clothing is frayed, their holes, their faces look scared, right? When is their next meal coming? From where? Are they going to be warm tonight? Just the hats, everything about this picture was terrifying and summed up for me why Jews fled. So forget the Hollywood notions. It's very easy to romanticize Tsarist Russia, to look at the Winter Palace, to look at these beautiful photographs or stories or movies of what it was like. And sure, if you were the Tsar, maybe it was a beautiful place to live, but for everybody else, certainly for my family, for Jews, it was horrid. And so I kept this picture with me as I wrote this book, really as the reminder of this is what we were leaving behind. At the same time, I really wanted to capture the energy, the moment, 1914. What was it like in the greater world? How could somebody, a man like Albert Einstein, stand up and say, I'm going to challenge Newton, right? That is a major thing to do. Well, it turns out that 1914 was actually on the cusp, right, of all kinds of an explosion of all kinds of ideas, that people were challenging all sorts of notions and historical, things that we accepted historically. We had fantastic artists like Modigliani breaking onto the scene. We have the fight for women's votes, for women's suffrage here in America, with people like Freud, figures like Chaim Weizmann. All of these massive thinkers are standing up and saying, we can figure out the universe. There's a faith in human ability, a belief in the importance of science, of math, of arts, right? In every single discipline. 1914 was the culmination, this moment of just this energy, this faith, and I loved it. I love it because there's so much to think about, right? This belief that we can challenge Newton, that we will understand our universe. And of course, it all comes crashing down with the start of World War I and this terrible moment in history. One of my favorite philosophers, Hannah Arendt, wrote that August 1914 touched off a chain reaction in which we have been caught ever since and which nobody seems to be able to stop. I think she's right. They're terrible wars, right? We're in a terrible cycle. But that moment just before 1914 is what I wanted to capture and put into this book, give to my characters. So, what is time? You probably noticed that that's a big theme in the book. That's a big theme in 1914 and for Einstein himself. I had a philosophy class as an undergrad where the professor walked in and she started off and she said, "What is time?" And I'm sitting there like, "What are you kidding me? Seconds, minutes, hours, right?" And she says, "No, we just made all of that up. That's a convention. We agree to call a minute, a second, right? We agreed that for some reason time is so important that we're going to count this way. But if you're Saturn or you're the moon, there's no such thing as showing up for a presentation at 8 p.m., right? Or spinning at a certain time period or anything else. It's just all made up. Time does not exist outside of humanities and human conventions. And this just sort of blew my mind in a way that, I just hadn't really thought about that. And philosophers for thousands of years have been asking this question: what is time? Why does it matter? Why do we feel that it's so important to mark time? Right? We have all kinds of expressions about killing time, wasting time, speeding up time. Why? Why does it matter that you have a birthday? Why does it matter that we count anything that we count with time now? So I joined the right thousands, millions of philosophers and people, billions, who have thought about this for years and years and dug in. And Einstein also was obsessed with this question: what is time? So let's take us back to 1914 to the early 1900s. What is Einstein doing? So in this picture, you can see him. He's in the background. And that's important because he's a nobody, right? He has these great ideas and he's coming up with them, but no one would give him a job. When he graduated, he got work. He found work in the patent examiner's office, very famously because a friend helped him, right? He didn't actually have any job offers lined up. This was a big favor and the only way he could support his family. And I love showing this picture because he's in the background. And we're so used to thinking of Einstein now in the front with the big hair and his comfortable self, right? And Princeton professorial and winning the Nobel Prize and all this. But at the time, he is in the background and people are trying to, convince him that he's crazy, that these ideas are crazy, but he persists and he says, "No, relativity, my ideas, I know they're right." I mean, can you imagine the strength of character that it takes to believe in yourself after you can't even get a job, right? Let alone publish a paper. Well, slowly he does start to publish them, of course, while he's working there, but in the beginning he didn't. And what he was working on were machines that could be used to synchronize clocks. So he spent his whole day looking at plans for pneumatic tube systems or flares, right? All these ideas, because it was important for the first time that we could agree on a time around the world. We had boats and trains and cars and all sorts of modes of transportation and meetings happening, and everyone in every country, especially in Europe, right, needed to agree that it's the same time in London as Paris. So you can, send a boat somewhere. You can't be off by 20, 30 minutes like you might have been 100 years earlier. So Einstein is spending every day thinking about this question: how are we going to synchronize clocks? And this is where he very famously comes up with the idea and starts thinking about light. Light is the one constant in the universe that we can use. That is how we synchronize clocks. So I love this idea because, of course, this leads to, well, how does light travel? Sure, we know the speed of light, but only if it's traveling in a straight line, because actually Einstein realizes light doesn't always travel in a straight line, and that's because the universe is not flat. Hence, we dig into relativity. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about relativity because it's important to the book, and it's such a mind-blowing, amazing idea. So Dan Burns is a high school teacher. Well, he just retired, I guess. He was a high school teacher in California, and actually found this video that he put up online. And I loved it because he so beautifully explains relativity to his high school students. And I just got in touch with him 2 weeks ago. I've been giving this presentation and talking about him for like a year and a half. And I just finally connected with him. And I guess a lot of people refer to this because he talks about, he sets up the universe. What you're looking at now in this big blue sort of circle is, picture the universe if it's empty. And you've probably seen this kind of experiment, this presentation, if you've been to science museums, especially in kids exhibits. This is how we show what relativity means. So in an empty universe, it's flat. If you take a ball and you roll it from one end to the other, what direction will the ball roll in? Well, it's going to go straight across from you, right? In a straight line. And you can imagine that, right? There's nothing that's going to change its course. It'll just go from one side to the other. But then Einstein realized, but as it rolls, it's not rolling just on top, right? There's a small divot underneath it as it rolls. It's actually changing the shape of this blue lycra underneath it, or the universe. And so he started thinking more, well, what is that? And that's where he came to this idea that actually we've been thinking of gravity in the wrong way. Newton introduced gravity to us in a way that wasn't correct. It wasn't the whole story. This is more a portrayal of gravity. So this black weight in the middle, imagine that's the sun in the center of our solar system. No longer is it a flat plane, this blue lycra, but it's indented, right? It's pulled in by gravity. Now, if you take that same ball and you roll it across from one side to the other, it won't go in a straight line. This time the ball will move slightly towards the center, right? It will wrap around, it will bend just slightly. And that is the theory of relativity. Einstein was famous for thought experiments. He has all kinds, I'm sure many of you are familiar with or have read about, right? His train experiments on synchronicities, like, can things be synchronized, happen simultaneously, the elevator experiments, right? There are all sorts of thought experiments. And this is where Einstein started. He then translated them into math, so you could calculate exactly by how much that ball would bend if it went across that blue sphere, that blue universe there, which is exactly what he was doing with his equations for relativity, and exactly what he wanted to photograph at the eclipse that my characters also went after, which is the degree to which light would bend around the sun. And you can only see it during a total solar eclipse because it's dark. And you can see the stars that you can't otherwise see. So that is the heart of what my characters are after. That is the heart of what Einstein was after. So as I dug more and more into the historical significance of this eclipse and what was happening in Russia and this moment in science, I found a couple of expeditions that actually made it to Russia. So these two photographs are actually of the American expedition that was in Russia in 1914. They were in Brovary at the dacha that I described. And I used these two photographs to help me imagine what my characters were doing. This is actually the equipment that they would have used, that Eddington would have used. And this also just blew my mind, because when I think of Einstein and I think of relativity, I think of something that's super modern, high tech, right? That we're looking at equipment more like this, that this is what he would use. But in fact, this is what Einstein used, Eddington used, my characters would have had. And for those of you that have gotten this far in the book, you know that I say my characters spent several weeks clearing the land, building, constructing, putting everything together. This is what they were doing. This is what they were building. And it just blew my mind. So this is a group that actually made it. They reported that they were not able to photograph the eclipse because of the rain and the clouds. So they spent all this time, money, effort, all their dreams went down with the weather that day. But again, I looked at this and I just thought, someone saw that eclipse. Someone was there, right? Someone had that picture, and hence Vanya sort of grew up in my mind. So I had to keep digging though, because these were fantastic pictures of Brovary and the expeditions to photograph the eclipse. But what did Russia in 1914 really look like? My characters spend a lot of time on trains and crossing the country, the empire. What did they see? Aside from Yivo, I also found sources like this National Geographic magazine. I actually bought a copy of this on eBay. And there's some colored pictures in here, but also just hundreds of drawings, illustrations that show the enormity of the Russian Empire and what the Tsar, saw all the differences in the people. It was amazing. It really was amazing. And I just started to get a better sense of what it was like to walk down the street. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures now of what I found. This picture I start off with because this is the same street in Moscow, 100 years apart. So if you look at the top, you see that there are men sitting there in the cobblestones and they're sorting them by hand. To me, it looks very dark and desolate. They're all looking down. Of course, it's winter because there are no leaves on the trees, but that's not the only reason for the desolation and the heaviness. Now we pass through wars and the city is crushed and rebuilt, and you get to the bottom and there's an energy there, people walking arm in arm, right? You see more different kinds of people, you see women, right? Just a totally different city. And people ask all the time, well, you must have spent you must have taken a lot of trips to Russia, spent a lot of time walking through the country. And I haven't, I've never been. I still have my two great aunts. They're like on each shoulder, right? They're saying, we left the country. You may not go to the Soviet Union. They've passed away. They would never want me to go to Russia. And I realize I'm an adult and I could take myself, but I still feel them in my head. And maybe it's a good thing because look at how different the country is and just how far it's come. And really, I needed my characters in my head to be in pictures like this one on the top. Here's another picture. This is the same exact location, 100 years apart, and you can see the same dome in the background there. But what a difference 100 years makes, right? You see the wasteland that is the top, the riverbank, and the bottom is just gorgeous, modern, beautiful. So this picture on the top actually inspired one of the passages in the book. If any of you have the blue hardcover, it starts on page 86. I'm going to read a passage. This is the riverbank in the book that Miri runs to. She's just had her first solo surgery. It didn't go as she wanted, and she's looking for her patient's mother. She gets lost and she comes out at the riverbank, and this is where Sasha, she finds him jumping from the train, and he, swims up on shore, and this is what she sees. So I wrote, Miri hurried. Without the sun, the air was tinged with the smell of damp, and the limestone buildings that framed the road looked darker than they should. As she descended into the slums, streetlights cast shadows that magnified the laddered appearance of the tiled rooftops. She tucked Tamara's hat into her bag and tried to think about how she'd break the news to Anatoly's mother. She thought she was following Tamara's careful directions, but she didn't know this section of the city, and in 4 turns, she was lost. She tried to retrace her steps, but when she came out at the river, she knew she was even farther from where she wanted to be, deep in the city's underbelly of mills and factories. She looked around, tried to plan her route home. Here's the next photograph that explains the next part. The triangular roof on the tower of Kovno Castle loomed in the distance. The bulk of the train station rose nearby, and the great bridge hung overhead. She'd always seen it from above, where the stanchions were polished and the roads sparkled with lamps, but from this new perspective, she saw it was decrepit. And the riverbank that appeared pristine was in fact a wasteland of gravel littered with rags and fish heads coated in pollen. So these are the actual photographs that inspired these passages and that I used to really think carefully, and see my characters where they were living. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures now from Russia in general from around that time, just to remind us of what it looked like, how different life was, the clothing, the speed, the pace of life. This picture, I love the boots that the men are wearing. You see the child is carrying the heavy burden on his head. Look at their hats. Look at their faces. No one is taking a selfie, right? They're not off to the side or anything. I mean, this was their life, and it doesn't look very happy. Here we have again the very serious faces. Sorry, those are my kids laughing in the background if you hear them. Yeah, all right. I can't really make them much quieter. This is one of my favorite photographs that I came across because the man in the black hat is actually a matchmaker. And of course, I have the character Babushka, who's a matchmaker also. And I love this photograph. He's talking to the man in the white hat, trying to find him his beshert, right, his soulmate. And the man in the white hat must have a fair amount of money because he has a fancy cane, a fancy suit, but look at all the mud caked onto their coats, their shoes, right? It's just this dirt, this dust pervades all of Russia. The language is the Hebrew lettering, but it's Yiddish. You see, right, different languages in the signs. You see this man sort of slinking in the back, and the barrel coated in rust and dirt and the packages. You know, when I write about these scenes of my characters slinking through alleys, ducking through corners, this is what they were walking past. And it just looked dank and, you know, and there's sort of this darkness to it that I tried to capture. This is also in Kovno. Of course, Kovno is now Kaunas, Lithuania. Countries, names of cities have changed. But here again, we see the Hebrew alphabet for Yiddish. We see different languages. You see the bars on the window, the heavy stone. It must be winter in this picture again because there are no leaves. You know, all the pictures I found almost were taken in the winter. And it just made it feel very heavy, very dark, the city that they grew up in, that they were born in. And then I found pictures from hospitals themselves. So in Russia, maybe even more than here, although some people have said maybe not more than here, you have the healthcare for the haves and the have-nots, right? So this picture was taken from what would have been the wealthy ward. The children are all smiling and round and clean, and they're laughing. Miri would have been nowhere near this ward, even in a Jewish hospital, because no one wanted to see a woman, a female doctor. They all thought they should only see a man, right? They didn't trust a woman. So she would have been working in the paupers ward that would have looked more like this. This is where people went who didn't have any money to pay for healthcare. And this is if you're rich, this is what you found. So there were a number of pictures that I found talking about these differences, and I'm going to read one more passage to talk about them here. It's on page 309, if any of you have the blue hardcover, to talk about how I described these stark differences. Miri met Anya in the lobby and followed her on a tour of the hospital. It was divided into distinct sections. The third floor was a converted attic where sleeping quarters were carved into the rafters. The second floor was for patrons and paying patients. Separated by a marble lobby, the men's and women's wards were gilded and frescoed, lit by chandeliers. The women read books and sewed. The men smoked cigarettes. Without the men wearing uniforms, Miri couldn't tell who was an officer, but Anya confided there were several. Since the hospital was known as the best in Kiev, even non-Jews came. And so Miri kept her head tucked low and didn't say a word. The first floor was for those who couldn't afford to pay. The men's and women's wings were gray and loud. Cots were shoehorned into every corner. Patients played cards and groaned and gambled. Children slept under their mothers' beds. It felt like Kovno's free clinic. As they walked through, Miri checked every male patient's face, just in case. So again, you see how I depict these differences based on these photographs that I found. And now I'm just going to go through a couple of sort of more of the fun pictures. You can see a little bit more of Jewish life in Russia. This is, Beit Sefer Ivri Amitai, so like a, just a Jewish school, a Hebrew school. Here we have a picture. Oh, sorry, I love pointing out, look at their knees and how their feet are dangling, right? Some of them aren't even big enough. I love those pictures. Here we see a picture of Riga. My characters spend a while in Riga, also a much cleaner, fancier, energetic city. Again, the difference, the juxtaposition of one side of the empire to the other. I talk about the spires like bejeweled fingers that rise up over the city. Just what a difference this city feels like to the others. And then here we have a picture of what was then the beginning of Sofim, or the Scout movement. And I talk about my character Yuri, who was pulled into this scouting movement. It's not like the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts here in America. It's very different. And it was built, right? It was established to help Jews learn to defend themselves, learn to go to Israel so they could start the kibbutz movement, right? The socialist movement, to fight, to rise up, but also to bring people together. And the Sophie movement is still very much alive today. When I lived in Israel, my kids were a part of it. And it was just, it was an amazing movement to think about how it started there. And I talk about how Yuri learned to fight, how, and Zittimer, the Jews there rose up and fought against the pogroms. And here we are. This is the beginning. This is one of the early camps where they're learning. And then also you see Jewish life alive here, right? This is, I guess they're getting ready for a Purim carnival as we get closer to Purim ourselves. And again, all these words are in Yiddish, but you see, right, the Hebrew language. So I'm gonna wrap it up there and move on to questions. And hopefully that gave you a good sense of where my research was. So, feel free to ask anything about the book or writing, or what can I tell you about?
I have to say, I love the last, now that Purim is coming up, I love the last picture of all those kids presumably dressed for Purim, and how not one of them was really smiling. There was like one kid on the bottom and every other kid was like, you put a crown on me, really?
Not so different now,
Yes,
maybe.
not exactly. There are some things, and we were talking about this a little earlier, but there are some parts of the human condition that are truly timeless, and I think Purim and Purim costumes might be one of them. That being said, um, uh, Mark and Marcia, can I turn to you for the first question?
You make the Miri a surgeon, and were there really female surgeons in Russia back then?
Yeah. So thanks for asking that. I'd love to talk about this. I really wanted Miri to be a forward thinking feminist, right? Ahead of her time, but I also wanted her to be realistic. And so when I sat down to give her a job outside of the home, right? Something other than being a nurse or a midwife, which so many women were, I really dug in to see what could a woman be doing. And I actually found two women who were working as surgeons in Russia at the time. Neither were Jewish. Both had been trained outside of the country. One was in France and one was trained in Switzerland. And then they came back to Russia and were sent off to like Siberia and practiced where they didn't have to see, right, where no man had to see them. But there were, in fact, those two women surgeons. And so I thought that that was a possibility, that she could have been, in fact, right, trained, and one of the very first there to be trained in Russia and certainly to be working. So while I didn't find direct evidence of a Jewish woman who was working as a surgeon, it is plausible, and I've spoken to many experts since, and I've been so lucky to have many presentations like this where people have said, yes, in fact, that was the very beginning. So that was sort of the moment that marked the moment that women started to enter medicine at those levels. And yeah, so I was thrilled to do that. And I worked very hard throughout this book to make everything historically accurate. Down to the Polyakov family, they're all real. My characters are all made up. They're all from my head, but everything that you see or come across is really true to history. It's accurate and true to life.
So I found the love story, really compelling and heartbreaking and, exciting. And how did why did you choose to tell this story in the frame, in some ways, of a romance?
Right. Well, so again, this goes to, well, what a woman in 1914 Russia, a Jewish woman, what was her life like? What was it about? Right. And it would have been focused on marriage and children. And no matter how feminist forward thinking you were, if you were a woman in the world in 1914, many would say now too, but certainly in 1914, your job was to get married and have children. And so there really wasn't a way, I thought, to tell the story without her, without men, right? Sort of around her, without her family forcing that idea of when are you going to marry? Who are you going to marry on her? And I really wanted her to have some sort of freedom or say in that too. And, I didn't want that to just be that she would walk away from it, because I didn't think that would be really realistic either, that she would also be searching for love. So that's how I landed on Yuri and Sasha. And, and I wanted them to be good guys. I loved them both. And I wanted her to love them both and you to love them both. So they were both in there, and it just seemed true to life. And then it added a whole other layer of excitement and fun to it also.
Yeah. Somebody else have a question? Nancy Federline, you were talking earlier about your experience chasing the eclipse. Would you just tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, amazing.
Yes, Rachel, hi. In 1999, there was a total eclipse of the sun over the Black Sea, and actually going across Europe, Northern Europe, and then east of the Black Sea. And my husband and I went on a boat, on a ship, and we witnessed it. We figured we wouldn't see anything on in Europe, and sure enough, there was rain. But the further east you got, the hotter the politics got. So we kind of stopped at the Black Sea, and it was absolutely the most awesome sight I have ever witnessed. As I said earlier, it was almost like God said, just stop and look and see what I can do. It was absolutely amazing. Then 3 years ago, it came over the United States, and our son lives in Kansas City. And the episode, one of the Umbra was going across Kansas City. So we went, we researched, we found a place, we went, and it was cloudy. And I was reading the book, and I was hoping and hoping and hoping that he would see the eclipse when you were talking about the rain and the clouds. And I was reliving what happened to us 4 years ago, where we were so disappointed. Well, we'd seen it, but our son hadn't, and I'd built it up in his mind, It really is serendipity as to whether you can actually see it. You're dependent on the weather. There was nothing you can do about it,
Yeah.
But
That's
I really
amazing.
enjoyed that part of it, that I was so glad that he was able to see it.
Thank you. But then you completely understood also that feeling of, this fear, and the animals panic, right? And the birds stop, and it's like it's night in the middle of day for this, 3 minutes or whatever it is. It's this surreal feeling, and you understand why people, are so scared of an eclipse, and why there are all these superstitions around it, and this terror, right? Even now, lots of people won't let their children outside during an eclipse, let alone their
That
animals.
was something that the priests, who were able to predict, were able to use it as power over the people, because they would predict that it would happen, and then the people didn't understand why it was happening. We were on the ship, so I was saying earlier, there was a 360-degree sunset over the Black Sea, and the temperature dropped 20 to 25 degrees. It was absolutely awesome. We didn't witness the birds or the animals because we were out on the water, but the actual event was absolutely awesome. And I was a science teacher, so this only happens because serendipitously the Earth and the Sun are the same relative size because of the ratios of their distances and their sizes. And in fact, the moon and the sun, the moon is actually moving away from the Earth. So there will come a time where there are no more solar eclipses. It'll only be the annular eclipse, because the moon will be too small. So it's really absolutely awesome.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That is awesome.
Thanks, Nancy. Could you tell us a little bit about the character Dima, and how he came about? And I see Marcia nodding her head, but could you just talk a little bit more about that character? And because some of us felt that he was also a hero in this story, in his own funky way.
Yeah. So Dima, I mean, he's a complicated character. I call him my pirate, right? And he's also not Jewish. And so, he plays this role I really wanted to highlight. So while I chose to make Miri and Vanya come from an affluent, right, educated family, most of Russia couldn't read. Most of Russia, had no education at all. And I wanted that to be clear, but also the power of education, right? And this understanding, this feeling of wanting to pull yourself up and learn so that you can make more from your life. And we think of it as the American dream a lot, but it wasn't just the American dream, right? There are other people all around the world. There's still people all around the world who understand that power of education, but also what I loved about him, I think of him as a real character, right? He's in my head, but they're all like real people to me, is that he was also not so proud that he was able to change his mind, right? As he learned, as he grew. And I think that's such a valuable asset, a valuable thing for people to remember, that just because you think one thing doesn't mean you should think the same thing a week from now, 3 weeks from now. That new information is important and you can learn new things and change your mind. And he is a hero in so many ways. And he's also grateful for what he learned, right? And I wanted to show that because I just, that idea of having an open mind, of being able to admit that you are wrong or you can learn, is something that I think Einstein also held on to, right? He admitted his math was wrong in 1914, that he needed help. He went to other scientists, other mathematicians, and asked them to help him work through his math, right? He said, I know I can't do this on my own. And it's so easy to look at a genius like Einstein and see him at the end of his life and think that he had everything easy and that it just came to him and was no problem. But Dima reminds us that actually that wasn't the case for Einstein. That's not the case for anybody. No matter how brilliant you are, you need people to help you. And Dima was both that help and he was helped. So I just had so much fun with him. And I wrote a lot more about Dima and it was cut because the book was already too long. But so it goes. I spent a lot of time with him and I'm so excited that you guys liked him that much too. Thank you.
So, the book is there. The book is so many things, right? It's a romance. It's a story about family and sibling relationships. It's a story about being a Jew in Russia, during a certain time in history. It's a story about science, and so much more. What do you think for, some of us have read this book, some of us here have not. What do you think, are the key lessons or like the key like ahas you hope that some, people might walk away with after reading your book?
I mean, I really want people to think about this notion that we can, like, truth and knowledge are powerful, and that, even like I was saying, even the geniuses in the world fall down. And that you can't do it on your own. You need family or you need other people, and you need a little bit of luck, but also that you're going to fall down a lot on your way. And, and also I've spoken to a lot of people about this idea, this question of when do we run? How do we know that it's so bad that we have to leave everything behind? Your language, your house, a dog, right? A favorite street, anything, a favorite food, when you have to leave it behind. And I really want people to think about that because so many people are still running, right? Today, immigrants stuck on the border, can't come in, are separated from their family, hopefully being reunited, right? But from all over the world, not just Jews, even now. And how horrible must your life be that you are willing to run, to give everything up? And I want people to think about that because I think it helps us approach the news differently, maybe our own family history differently. if you're someone who's reading a book and we're lucky enough to be here talking about this tonight, what a gift that is. And there are many people who don't have that. And it's, how lucky are we? And also, to just think about that. When do we run? Like, I think about my great aunts all the time telling me, you'll know. And I still think, how will I know when it's that bad? What will it take? And I don't know the answer to that. And I guess I'm very lucky for that right now.
You managed to, Marcia, thanks.
I just wanted to say, I'm so glad you showed those photographs, because I was so taken with your description and the setting that, the way you described every place and the travels and where they were in that place and time. It was clear that you had done a lot of research on that. This isn't so much a question, but I didn't know where Kovno was, so I had to go look it up on Google Maps. I found out it was in Lithuania. It's called something else now. But then, the trains to get down to Kyiv and just the travel. And I mean, did you have train schedules? Did you did you research how often the trains ran and where they stopped or what route it would have been? And just, there was so much detail on that it was like, that was pretty impressive.
Thank you. I did a lot of research on the train routes, not on the actual schedules, but in terms of how often they might be running. And the train travel times were the one thing in the book that I exaggerated slightly. I kept them on trains a little bit longer than they might have been, although it's hard to tell because trains did break down, tracks did break, right? If a military transport was going through, they had to make way. But if you had a straight shot, it would have been faster than what I had them on. But trains were the core of life in Russia then. And, the construction of the railroads themselves were, affected everybody, all over the country. So I did spend a lot of time on the trains and looking at pictures of trains. So I knew, for example, that when Vanya was in there, if he was smacked his elbow or his head, what did he hit? And that there were goggles hanging on the side and stuff like that. Because you can really only get that detail from a photograph. You're not going to read a history book that says, and when you walk into the engine room, you will see on the right a pair of goggles suspended, from the side. So, so I did a lot. So thank you for recognizing that. Because I always wonder if anyone notices how much goes into that.
Bela.
Yeah, I enjoyed the book as well, but I just want to know if you based the character, the grandmother, Babushka, on anybody in particular.
She probably has a little bit of my great aunts in her, but no one really in particular other than a matriarchal matchmaker. So I just, I guess she is my great aunts in many ways. So is Ethel.
You did such a good job creating these dynamic women, and between Babushka and Miri, and it was just, I think it's something that I really appreciated, and also just, there is so much passion in each one of the characters for life and their life pursuit. And I would say, for me, that's another takeaway. But, and so that being said, you do have another book coming out in 2022, Atomic Annie. Could you just tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
Yes, thank you so much for asking, because I'm literally in deep edits right now for Atomic Anna. She's like taken over my head. So I just love to read books with women at the center, strong women. So I end up writing books with strong women. So Atomic Anna is the story of 3 generations of women in one family. They're in the Soviet Union to America, and they work together to build a time machine to stop Chernobyl. So again, bringing in relativity and theories there for time travel. So
it's a little bit of suspend your disbelief as well.
Yes, yes. I don't know. Maybe the time machine is real. We wouldn't know.
That's true. That's true. I mean, there's a reason that Back to the Future was such a hit.
Exactly.
So we all want to believe it's possible and true. I see people nodding their heads.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank you so much for your time tonight. I want to remind people that if you haven't already, you can find A Bend in the Stars. We hope at first your first attempt will be for your local bookstore. I'm sure you can order it through the Dolphin if you live in Port Washington, or whatever your neighborhood bookstore is. For those of you who are coming or who are visiting us from around the country, and also, of course, you can order it on Amazon. And what we'll do is I'll be sending out a link with the recording of this talk if you'd like to forward it to a friend, and it will also include a link to the Amazon, an Amazon link if you'd like to order the book online. So Rachel, thank you so very, very much. And we really appreciate your time, and congratulations on writing such a great story with such rich characters. And we're really looking forward to your next book.
Thank you so much. This was such a blast. I love speaking to readers who love books as much as you guys. So thank you.
Thank you so very much. Friends, that's the end of our program. Please stay in touch and we'll let you know what else we have coming up soon. So great to see you, and have a wonderful night, everyone. Stay safe out there.